I'd like to welcome the three panelists who will take this discussion forward. Cinzia Alcidi from the CEPS, where she heads the Economic Policy Unit, previous background in economic policy at the ILO and in teaching economics in Perugia. And I was pleased to see a fellow alumnus of the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, which is also one of my alma maters. Dann, head of management of Bruegel, making sure that Bruegel functions as a think tank, and with a broad background in the media, and graduate both of Key University in the UK and of the Solvay Business School here in Brussels. And lastly, Paweł Świeboda, deputy head of the EPSC, the Commission in-house strategic planning body or think tank, whatever way you would wish to present it. Previously head of Demos Europa in Warsaw, and with a past in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, head of the Europe Department and advisor to the President of Poland on European issues, on EU issues. And a fellow alumnus of my other alma mater, the London School of Economics. So I'm glad to be well surrounded here by colleagues. I'm going to hand over very quickly to our panelists, just to provoke their comments. A few remarks from my side. One is, how do you find the right balance between in-depth analysis to help inform policy making and quick responses to the ever-increasing pressures of, say, the shorter media cycle and the shorter political cycle of attention spans, where people want to be able to come up with a quick 3 pages of analysis to be found via Twitter or whatever, which may help but may not be sufficient to guide informed policy making. The other one is your views on the interaction between think tanks and governments or authorities, governments, parliaments, other public authorities. We've often looked with great envy at the US tradition of people moving in and out of government. Right now, some comments we see look at this moving in and out of government with a greater degree of concern for the future US administration. And the one thing one can see is that some think tanks have become much narrower in the focus of their work to serve more as a recruiting platform, making a bet on which candidate will win and therefore how you will enter a possible new administration. That, of course, limits the scope of their thinking and might therefore limit the value of that thinking to the policymakers. Now, the Commission with the EPSC has taken a different approach. They've taken think tankers in, but they've left them as think tankers within the institution. Is that an appropriate European model compared to the American model? Then the relations of think tanks with the public and public debate. Think tanks are out there and should be out there and engage in the public debate. That's become somewhat more challenging in what's now come to be known as a post-truth society. If think tanks wish to be fact-based in their approaches. And lastly, the standard question, how do you deal with the budgetary pressures and still maintain your autonomy when you get large funding from interested parties, be they government or private sector? With that, I'd like to hand over to the panelists. I don't know, Cinzia, if I can ask you to kick off with a few comments.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's a sort of an unusual setting for me. Last time I was here, we discussed about fiscal capacity of the euro area, so a completely different topic. Let me try to touch upon some of the points you mentioned in your question, in particular starting with your first question by telling you a little story. I think I don't need to convince you that one of the biggest changes of the last year have involved communication. And what we have experienced, all of us, it's the exposure to higher volumes and higher speeds of information. We are bombarded by information. On the other side, we are all exposed to an increased pressure to deliver quickly, to deliver the results. Patterns of tenure have become shorter. Think of jobs, marriages. So many aspects of our life are actually putting some pressure on the way the brain works. So some scientists are actually saying that these pressures are inducing a sort of neurological rewiring. What does that mean? It means that the brain is just adapting to a lot of information coming at higher speed. And the way it adapts is that it devotes less attention to the information. You reduce the span of attention. The further implication of this is basically that we do not process information. We get a lot of information, but we do not elaborate it. This means that it stayed for a shorter time in our memory, so we tend to forget. And this post-factual, this post-truth, is actually related to this phenomenon, because you get a lot of information, you actually get confused about the kind of information you received, because this information may go in different directions. And despite the fact that you could check in real time barely any kind of statement that you see on TV, this doesn't really matter a lot. And I think this is a great challenge for all aspects of our life. Looks at the kind of results that can deliver in politics. But it's a huge challenge for think tanks as well. And this actually led me to one of the point that was one of the remarks which was made earlier is how can we find the balance between being part of the debate, so being part of this stream of information in a quick way, so quick response, but on the other side, be able to stay there because we need to convey a message which is based on facts. This, I think, it's one of the key missions of think tank, which is based on deep analysis and which sometimes involve a message which is complex. So we end up basically spending as much time in making a complex message understandable and short to be tweeted as the time we need to produce it. And this is a quite sort of paradox. I think this is one of the greatest challenge for think tanks. Concerning the work I personally do, we really try to focus on the in-depth analysis. I think this relates very much to the fact that our main target is the political class, is the policymakers, is the thinking elite. And this needs to be fed with an in-depth analysis and elaborated information. That's at least the way I see the role of think tank. Of course, the risk is that you can be sidelined, because if the message is too difficult to be understood, it's just not part of the debate, or is overcome from other messages which are easier to understand. So this is really making the future of think tank much more challenging. Maybe I will stop here, or if you want to a question.
No, thank you very much. Matt, would you like to make a few comments too? Do you agree that it's necessary and reasonable to spend as much time on the condensation of the message as on the elaboration of the thinking behind it?
I do think it is, and our approach has always been to spend as much time thinking about how to disseminate the message and how to have impact and how to change policy, as that is our mission. Our mission is to change and improve policy making in Europe, and therefore the ideas simply aren't good enough. I think that the idea that we either have to be in depth or have quick responses it's an unnecessary binary, and we can do both. We can tweet something short, and we can point to a longer analysis. One of the things that I think we are seeing in the think tank world, and I think this is the future of the think tank world, is for us to become much more professional, not just in the way that we do our research, but in the way we disseminate it. So at Bruegel, we have a regular exercise in segmenting our audience, and we do exactly the same as Coca-Cola. It's it's not an accident that you can go into the shop now and buy Coke, Coke Life, Coke Zero, Diet Coke. We do the same thing, okay? And if you want to know which of our products is Coke Light, I'd be happy to tell you and show you later. So we need to be more professional in terms of disseminating the message, and that is the future of think tanks. It's not just about being professional in producing the actual ideas. I want to challenge the idea that we are in a post-factual world. And maybe you might call me naive because I'm British, and I'm hoping that that there are still some sensible people left in the country I come from. But I have to remind you that 48% of the voting public in the UK were probably not led by post-factual ideas. Because they voted to remain in the EU, and it's the same in the US. The popular vote for Mrs. Clinton was higher than for Mr. Trump, so we are not yet in a post-factual world. And I think that, again, this is something in the dissemination of our work that think tanks can be more professional about, and certainly in segmenting the audience, we can address that with different products, which understand the idea that it's not just about facts, but it is also about analysis and how you present the message. I also want to say something about budgetary autonomy and independence. It's interesting that we require think tanks to always be totally independent and non-biased. I think that that's actually unnecessary. I think the question should be, are you independent enough to carry out your mission? And is it clear to the public where you come from and what your motivation is? And I think that the future of think tanks will be about not telling the public that we are independent, but giving the evidence and allowing the public to make that decision. Certainly that's something that we do now and continue to improve, and I think that is also the future of think tanks. I think if we've learned anything from Brexit and from the election of Mr. Trump, it's that when we give messages to the public, we have to give them with more than the caveat of "trust me, I'm a think tanker," or "trust me, I'm a doctor," or "trust me, I am a commissioner or a prime minister." So,
just basically trust me.
No, I think we have to prove that we can be trusted, and that's just as important as the way we present the message and the short term versus the long term.
Thanks very much. Paweł.
Christian, thanks very much. I think we are in a think tank moment, and the post-factual is one of the reasons, but there are several others that have already been referred to. I think the degree of complexity of decision-making is for me definitely one of them. The speed with which we are bombarded with information and the speed of change, and finally polarization and granularity of our societies. It is simply altogether way more difficult in today's world to build a policy consensus. So that is, in a way, an entirely different and more challenging context for the way think tanks operate. But it's also, in a way, liberating. I don't know if you read yesterday, Shadi Amit published a piece in Foreign Policy called "The End of the World." where he argues that, well, the history is now back with us, that not everything is decided, as Fukuyama argued to some extent, and many things are in play, and there is something to fight for. So he interpreted that in a positive sense at the end of the article, saying we now have regained a sense of purpose. And I think there is something to it, and I think there is something to it which relates directly to what the think tanks are about. Because both our future scenarios are in play, and there is also onslaught on evidence-based policy, and which is at the heart of what think tanks do. So we have to defend that case for evidence-based policy wholeheartedly. But we probably need to understand at the very outset the nature of the moment, and separate, the real grievances that people feel from imaginary grievances, because we are faced with both. Easier said than done, but nevertheless, I think think tank community needs to edge in that direction. We need to be able to redefine a sense of direction for the Western society as a whole. So I think we need to aggregate a little bit more, because when you look at the evolution of think tanks, they started in more generalist fashion, and they have tended to zoom in on very narrow sectorial issues. There are many think tanks now which are launched in very specific policy area, be it health or environment. So I think we need to be able to zoom out again in order to make the case for what we stand for. You asked about going deeper versus being quick in response. I think that begs the question of what form think tanks will take in the future, and I think it will increasingly be a hybrid form. There will be a lot of thinking and analysis, but there will also be sort of quasi-media activity, which is already being pursued, but I think there's going to be more of that. And there will have to be more activism as well. I think it won't suffice that we just put our wisdom on a sheet of paper that possibly no one will read. We will need to do more to make sure that it does enter public debates, that people get connected to it, and that people can stand for it. I think there is also a role, and I mentioned that in this short essay. There is a role for think tanks in preserving the diversity of opinion, because certainly this phenomenon of groupthink is one of the bigger risks to the future of liberal democracy. And I think think tanks have a role to play. Possibly we will see in that field more attempts to link different points of view and create some sort of Airbnb of think tanks, by means of which we won't necessarily have more of our established institutions that have their offices that sit in the same place, but we will probably go more in the direction of connecting minds, because that's what this period will require.
All right. Thank you for that. Let me pick up on one thing that Matt said, and one of yours too, Paweł. Matt, you said our mission, or the mission of think tanks, is to change policy. Who decides the direction of change? Is your mission to promote change of policy, or to change policy? And if it's to change policy, is it your board? Is it the financiers? Is it the patrons, whoever they may be? Is it the administration you hope to join next? Brings us back to those questions. So what does change mean? Are the think tanks there to actually change, which makes them militant, and we see some militant think tanks out there, or are they there to promote debate towards change, which is a different concept? And that comes closer to the Airbnb, maybe, that Paweł mentioned. I don't know whether the commission model with the EPSC is a precursor. The EPSC is a kind of first Airbnb hostel, or whether there are others of that kind as well. The preservation of diversity of opinion that you mentioned, Paweł, is that to be sought within each think tank, or is it to promote the multiplicity of think tanks in order to have different streams of thought? I suspect we're going more in that direction than diversity of opinion within think tanks. But those are just some random thoughts that I throw out to provoke more comments from you. So I don't know whether Cinzia, Matt, Paweł, you would like to jump in on any of those.
I'd be happy to jump in. I'd be happy to jump in first because I want to correct myself. I did correct myself earlier. Rather than change, our mission is to improve policymaking. And obviously in the improvement, it means change. And that's our specific mission. And other think tanks have their mission. We're mission-led. And from my perspective, it's about improving policy. Now, who decides to do that? The thinkers decide to do that. It's one of my roles to... Sorry, the Madonna mic is falling off. It's my role to make sure that our researchers don't have to do anything but research and don't have to do anything but think. They do not need to hold themselves accountable to any funders, to the board, to anybody. They don't need to raise money. They do need to open a Twitter profile and attend media training, but the rest of their time is spent thinking. And it's up to them to work out how we can improve policy. And we've set up the way Bruegel works so that our researchers are entirely free to do that. In preserving the diversity of opinion, that's a very interesting question, and something that we had to address directly during the Brexit debate, if we can call it a debate. As a Brussels-based organization where most of the people were in favor of the European project, we were never going to be listened to in London, simply because we were based in Brussels. So we hired a Eurosceptic and we allowed him to write away, and he was inside the house.
Did he convince others towards Euroscepticism, or did you convince him of the merits of the European project, or you parted friends but on your positions?
We parted. Let's see if we parted. I mean, I think whether we remain friends or not remains to be seen. We haven't cut him off entirely. It was difficult for us to do. It was really difficult for us to do, but it was a good exercise, and I think it was essential. And we never would have got any. We never would have had any hearing in London without having done that. And it was a brave thing to do when you consider that most of the people in-house are for more European integration. So I think we can do a lot to preserve the diversity of opinion by, most of us take no institutional standpoint, which means that we can hold two contrary opinions at the same time. And I think as think tanks, in order to promote a quality debate, we should do that more often. And I think that, again, in the future, that's something that we will be doing. And it helps to stop groupthink inside the think tank.
Let me also jump in this discussion. So at CEPS, our main objective is to spot challenges to the EU and then come up with policy options and possibly recommendations which are based also on political feasibility. As a researcher, I have to raise money. That's for us actually key, because we not receive any funding. And the way I do is I submit research proposals to a variety of possible institutions interested in it. It's not compulsory to me to open a Twitter account, although the director of communication of CEPS would be very happy if I have one. So this is a bit expression of the diversity of opinions, which is actually one of the features of CEPS, because in CEPS we do not have a CEPS view on many topics. So it's the idea that the different thinkers can come up with different options on the same matter. Those dealing with economics may know that Paul de Graaf and Daniel Gross are both at CEPS, and you may know that their opinions are not exactly on the same line. So this is actually for us one of the elements which can ensure independence, and then the fact that what the recommendations we come up with is really the result of the work of the thinkers.
I think, Christian, that there are different degrees of diversity of views, and I think it's entirely natural for a think tank to try to preserve a degree of cohesion. Of course, there are individual analysts who have their points of view, and I think each of our think tanks represents quite richness of thought, and that I think is a value in itself. But what I meant primarily is an openness to the views of the other side, which we often don't demonstrate because we think we know better. And it is hard in a situation like this, as of last Wednesday, to try to understand the other side, because we ourselves easily classify the other as wrong. What I did the other day is I looked up what Steve Bannon has said publicly now that he's named to be the chief strategist of the White House. And he hasn't said many things on the world, but he has said a few, which are interesting. There's a long excerpt of his speech at the Vatican, in fact, 2 years ago, published by BuzzFeed, which I found revealing, because it tells you a lot, not that you're going to share the guy's point of view, but you're going to understand better where he comes from and what is ahead for us, because after all, that's our main objective, to prepare better for the future. And if we are to prepare better, we need to understand what are the underlying currents. So this openness to the other, I think, is fundamental, but also a degree of flexibility. A degree of flexibility understood as being able to modify and change when circumstances are different. And I think very, very often we are cursed by our inability to adapt to the changing circumstances. And think tanks in particular, even though they might have pursued other policy line, they should be at the forefront of that argument, making the case for an adaptation when circumstances change. Thank you.
Now let me open it up to the audience to come with your comments, questions, remarks as well. As I invite you to speak, I'd ask you to tell us who you are and what organization or entity you come from. I had a first question over here. Are there, okay, well, that's a second question, but.
Thank you. My name is Marco Incerti, and from CEPS. I'm the person who is trying to convince Cinzia to open a Twitter account. And I'd like to make 2 points about this issue of in-depth versus short-term analysis. The first one, I mean, this Twitter thing is not just about Twitter. It's the old Churchill quote. You know, it takes no time to prepare a 2-hour speech. It takes 2 weeks of preparation to condense a message in 2 points, in 2 minutes. And I think that is a key skill for think tankers, because they are not only supposed to interact with their academic peers, they're also supposed to reach out to policymakers who have not, it's not the short time span that they can concentrate, it's just that they have to do so many things. But in this respect, I also, since Jim Close has arrived, I wanted to refer to something he said yesterday, the big challenge of taking the time to think. Now, as think tankers, and people who do in-depth work like CEPS and Bruegel, we also have that challenge. Because even when we think in depth, it's always with a 3-5 years time horizon. We are looking at the next, budget cycle. We are looking at the next European semester, what will happen in the coming years. As Paweł also said, now it's a time to zoom out. And the big challenge for us is, where do you find the time and resources, including economic ones, to actually think about the longer term? From that point of view, I think, having been involved in ESPAS, it was very useful for us to have the money to be able to sit back and think, okay, what might happen over the 2030 time horizon? The trouble is that there's not that many projects like that, so I encourage the three institutions to continue working along those lines, and hopefully we can all find solutions together.
Thank you. Now, for the second speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thomas Arnold, DG Research and Innovation. Question about the post-factual world. We are still surrounded by many facts, and they are used to prove everything, and it's contrary. They're used by interests to prove, by stakeholders to prove their different points of views. So is it not so much a post-factual world, but the end of a monofactual world? Are we not entering into a poly, a multi, or even, let's call it, a contrafactual world, where it becomes much more important each time to question the underlying assumptions for the different composings of the facts? And is this not actually a major opportunity? Because it can precisely, okay, now you can say it's messy, it's complex, but it is a major opportunity to address the groupthink issue and to put forward also the diversity of opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a third comment over there.
Thank you. Søren Fransen. Is it working? Yeah, Søren Fransen, Aarhus University. Yesterday, we heard about the immense challenges facing policymakers. We also heard about the immense or great opportunities technology provide. And we also heard that there is a lack of risk-taking, conformity, and group thinking in our institutions that actually address and tell our policy makers how to behave and like and do. Isn't this a great opportunity for think tanks actually to fill that room? And our civil servants are not risk takers because of career reasons, as we discussed yesterday, and all those issues that is really facing our institutions from inside. Isn't this a great opportunity for think tanks to take that platform and fill that room and really be concerned about creativity and new thinking? I would like to hear the think tanks to address what that require of agility and creativity in the way you work.
Should we take one more comment from the floor before I give the speakers a chance to come back in, and then we can take a second round? I've got a lady here in front. And then, yeah.
Many thanks. Kat Tully from the School of International Futures. I'd like to pick up on the point around trust me, and actually ask what are the relationships that think tanks should have in the future with their citizens, and how does that relate to the purpose of think tanks and the nature of knowledge in a world in which social media and lots of information and power and perspectives are distributed rather than focused in the elite? And my particular question is around how are your methods and practices evolving in a world where we have citizen scientists, where we can data mine, but yet we need more ethnographic understanding of what that data mining actually means, and where we actually need to focus our attention perhaps not so much on facts, but the perception gap, the latent buzzard effect that they talk about, which is that we're not talking so much about security, but perceptions and feelings of security, and that those issues are just as important as having objective answers to questions of security. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, who would like to jump in on this? Do you want to come in, Cinzia?
Okay, I can start.
Yep.
I would like to make a comment which is actually picking up on two questions. The digital revolution and the fact that the technology is becoming pervasive of all aspects of life, it's of course an opportunity. But I think we don't know how to manage it. We do not know how to manage multifactual reality. That is the challenge. We see it as an opportunity, but it's something new, and we don't know exactly how to deal with. The other thing is that we are, I think, witness of paradigm shifts in many areas. This is certainly happening in economics. The opening speech mentioned the fact that for political parties, there are big challenges out there. There are all these changes which I think are kind of signal a really deep change in the system. And I think we are not really prepared to face it in the sense that we do not have a good understanding of it. So I'm not saying that there are not opportunities. Probably there are great opportunities, but it is very difficult. Just to make you an example, one of the, I think, key product of think tanks should be foresight. You know, we need to think of the long term. This should be an output extremely helpful to policymakers. Now, we participate in the report of the ESPAS work, and what you do is basically to think of scenarios for the future. And what you do is you need to attribute some probability. It's not exact numbers, but you should be able to identify what kind of scenario is more likely. If you are in paradigm shifts, or the system which is changing, the anti-establishment movements and all these kind of things, how can you make a sensible foresight? You will end up with a situation where the more extreme scenarios are likely in the same way. So this reduces very much the value added of the exercise. This is, I think, one of the greatest challenges for think tanks, but probably also for universities and all those who look at the future and the opportunities that can arise from innovation.
Thanks. Paweł, you want to?
Yes, I mean, there was a question if we are witnessing the end of monofactual worlds. And I think there is something to it, even though the onslaught of the post-factual is for real, and it's enabled by modern digital means. It's not a coincidence that we have the post-factual society when we have the post-factual society, because now the conditions are ripe for this type of a situation to arise. Because the barriers of entry have been lowered, and all of us are probably broadcasters in one way or the other, because all of us interact in various ways. And do we always verify what we put out? Well, we do our best, but not everybody does, of course. And there are people who instrumentally put out non-facts and lies, and that's a fact of life. I'm afraid. So there is something more to it, but I think the question was really referring to a change of paradigm which we are witnessing, and I think that is true, that we are at a juncture that will usher in something new when it comes to our socio-political order. What it is going to be, we don't know. That's why we meet in ESPAS to discuss it. But I think we have this overwhelming sense that we are at a juncture that will lead us to a new situation. Also because there is a challenge to the rationality which has been at the heart of our policy making and our liberal democracies for years, and the cultural, the emotional enters the equation and carves out ever more of the space. So it's no longer for the reasons of economic rationality that our governments will cater. Unfortunately, that space will probably shrink even more. And other identity-related, culture-related factors will become ever more prominent, which is again a challenge for think tanks, because we are really anchored on the understanding of economic rationality, which is probably somewhat fading away. Of course, not entirely, and we will do our best to defend it. But that situation is taking place.
Matt.
To answer the question first about relationships with citizens, this is a very important question for the future of think tanks. In the past, our relationship with the public was conducted entirely through the media, the traditional media, and of course they have their own agendas. And for the first time, we have the opportunity to have a discussion with the public directly through digital. It is a challenge, and I think that the way we address that and the question about facts being used by both sides is that think tanks have to get better at creating a narrative. Our research shouldn't simply be academic analysis that is very raw. We also need to create a narrative. We need to create a narrative that says, what's the context in which we are promoting this idea? Why is it necessary? I think also something that we've always tried to do is to recognize that if you are promoting a change in the status quo, which is what changing policy making is, you have to accept that when you change the status quo, somebody loses something. And I think that more and more think tanks will need to address the fact that somebody will lose something, and that needs to be addressed too. When I speak to students, I say, we may not care about it. If we decide to have a financial transaction tax and banks make slightly less profit, we probably wouldn't care about that. But there are other areas where we do care, and we want to address who loses in taking the status quo. I want to also address risk-taking. If any of you know our work, you know that we take risks. We don't necessarily enjoy taking risks. We have to weigh up the risk against the pragmatism of the idea. We've received a lot of flack as an institution in trying to strike down one of the holy cows of the European Union and saying, well, actually, you don't really need the free movement of people for the proper functioning of the single market. That was an enormous risk, and we paid an enormous price for that. Encourage us to take risks, but do remember that we also have mortgages to pay, and we need to be able to get funding to continue to take risks. The bigger question is, for us, how pragmatic should we be? How much should we take into consideration the political economy? That's what my economist colleagues call it. I call it the real world. Post the financial crisis, we've had to take that more into account. And this is another way of saying that is that think tanks used to work on what was perfect. Now we have to work on what's possible. And that is often different from what's perfect. Risk-taking will continue to do, but within a certain framework. I want to go back to the perception gap and imaginary grievances. Again, I think that understanding how the other side thinks is incredibly important, and I think that we need to work harder to be able to do that. I was recently at a conference for think tanks, and the shocking realization for most of them was to realize that they were considered to be part of the elite. A lot of the assumptions that we work on as think tanks are now being challenged, and I think that understanding how the 52% in the UK thinks, how Trump voters think, and using the same methods of analysis will help us to be able to address that.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that there are others who would like to intervene as well, but we are out of time, and therefore I think we will need to, out of respect for the speakers in the coming sessions, to wrap this up. I don't know whether any of the three speakers would like to come with any last comments, and maybe to come back to one of my initial questions, which you haven't really touched on, which is what I call the revolving door, the relation between public authority, government and others, and think tanks. And just Paweł has made the reverse journey, so to speak, from public government into think tankery. But to ask Cinzia and Matt, would you consider or even harbor the hope of having the revolving door in Europe and being able to move into government and actually shape policy from government side as a break from think tankery, or are you happy with the European model of staying at one step remove and doing that thinking and informing government? And how do you see that as well, Matt? Do you see that as a reasonable balance, or do you think that your experience from the revolving door would give you a greater appetite for more? All in 1 minute for each of you.
Maybe just one word. Since last year at CEPS, we have a new program which is called CEPS Academy. It is basically about the idea of getting in touch and building a network with universities, students, but also people working in national ministries, get them to Brussels and try to discuss about EU policy making in real time. So the approach in this case is different. It's really to establish a much more closer dialogue with people from the capitals, and especially young people, and those who are likely maybe to become the leaders of the future.
Matt?
Yeah, I echo that. There isn't one revolving door. There are 28 for the member states, and then
What wealth of opportunity.
and goodness knows how many more in terms of the institutions. My worry as a manager about the revolving door is that I do worry about losing talented people to the institutions, and I'm afraid it happens all the time because we don't have the resources to pay them as much.
Paweł?
I think the experience, and I've traveled sort of both ways in the past, and I think the experience of both being in government is priceless, but also the experience of being outside is priceless, because and one helps the other, because when you have been in an administration, you know what is possible, you know what are the parameters for your thinking. But being outside is liberating. Yeah? You learn much more than you would have inside the structure. So in the ideal world, I think the fusion of the two really gives you the right type of experience, and we should probably discuss how to make it possible at a larger scale.
All right. Please thank you to the three panelists. Join me in thanking Cinzia, Matt, and Paweł for their contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.